So first thing to look at is how after Second World War, this part of the region that we today call Indo-Pacific had several uh, violent episodes, both inside a nation state, like for about 2 decades, there was enormous disruption inside China, which is the largest country in the region. But also it followed with disruptions in Japan, and Japan had already disrupted much of Southeast Asia. Then we had Korean War, we had Vietnam War. And after that, the region stabilized. And when a region stabilizes, then you have younger population becoming much more productive and much more effective in taking the country forward in economic development. So Japan at that time in early 70s onwards took the lead and created what was known as tiger economies, which became ASEAN from 6 to 10. So from 1990s onwards, this region had seen rapid economic development, and ASEAN had ensured that there was no intra-ASEAN wars to be fought. And from 1990s also we started seeing rise of China, and that rise was connected to the neighboring countries. China's rise would not have been possible minus the rise of its periphery. So the whole region was becoming economically vibrant. India was not yet part of this growth story. But China was now becoming part of the growth story. And you would remember from late 1990s when there were East Asian financial crisis, Chinese were the first to go and help. And China became an integral part of this Southeast Asia, East Asia growth story in that sense. And that gave us a new expression called Pacific Asia or Asia Pacific, which United States and Europe started engaging because they were now growing very rapidly and transforming very rapidly. And by the time we reach early 2000s, please, we now have a situation where China is growing very rapidly, and China, not Japan, is on the lead in building that growth story of this region called Asia Pacific. Now, after Second World War, United States, as the leading player in international relations, had established North Atlantic Treaty Organization to ensure peace in North Atlantic, which was North America and Europe. And for this region, they had also created something called Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, like North Atlantic Treaty Organization, CETO, and CENTO, Central Treaty Organization. Those two military alliances did not work in this region, and then they used ASEAN to first try to contain spread of communism and then to soft balance this huge panda, China, emerging as a game changer. So fundamentally what is happening here is, whereas United States had looked at this region with a focus on stability being the first priority, then we will lead to prosperity, Chinese turned it upside down. They pushed for priority first, prosperity first, and then prosperity will bring perhaps stability as well, because aspirations are being fulfilled. So it is Chinese seamless economic relationship with these two rims, Indian Ocean rim and the Pacific rim, that changed our imagination of what US-led imagination of the region was. Pacific Command was looking after the Pacific Ocean, and Central Command was looking at India, Pakistan, and Indian Ocean. But China's economic relationship connected this whole region, two rims. And that is what rise of China and connectivity of this entire region made some of the Western countries, which was again triggered by tsunami. You may have heard that story, how these countries came together, and from 2007 wanted to start discussing in a quadrilateral framework. It appeared very interesting that what I call the trigger of this new imagination, which is China, because Chinese did not divide this region into Indian Ocean being separate from Pacific Ocean. But the trigger of this new growth story of Indo-Pacific being seen as one has remained as an outlier. Western narratives and initiatives have only looked at China as a target to be restrained rather than significant central force to this seamless connect of two oceans to be co-opted into some arrangement. It's been kept out and treated as a target still to be restrained by these Western efforts. But that's not how things have happened. Obviously, China's influence continues. China today has nearly $700 billion of trade with ASEAN countries, only 10 ASEAN countries. To give you a little comparison, India's trade with ASEAN now is $130 billion. China's is nearly $700 billion. So China remains a very important force. So this whole region has become very smart. What they do is that they engage United States for all the security arrangements and engage Chinese for all the economic trade, investment, technology transfers and travel and tourism and so on. Where does India come into it? I told you a story of this Indo-Pacific region being a fantastic growth story, and that's where the whole world is looking at Indo-Pacific. All major nations, France, Germany, UK, Canada, United States, everybody has issued their Indo-Pacific strategies as to how they wish to engage this region, which is vibrant, economically very, very progressive now. And economic progress has led to also changes in politics, changes in social fabrics, changes in values, changes in lifestyles, urbanization, and so on. So region is definitely vibrant, and as we often say, geopolitical focus or gravitation point has shifted from North Atlantic to Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Chinese also stayed out of the narratives of Western countries because they themselves were shy. They did not also show any enthusiasm to even start using the expression of Indo-Pacific in their own narratives of world politics, which is perfectly normal when you look at how Chinese behave. Chinese take their own time to accept new things, particularly if new things are not their own creation. So they took a whole decade of 1970s to begin a formal relationship with the United States. 1972, Nixon had come to Beijing. This was the first instance of US president going to China, which is a country not yet recognized by United States. And they took the whole decade till 1979 when formally diplomatic relations came in place. So likewise, they took another 10 to 15 years to gradually become part of several other international organizations like Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and export control regimes and several others. Of course, in UN Security Council, they were immediately accepted as a replacement for Taiwan, which is Republic of China. The China we are talking is the People's Republic of China, not just Republic of China. So Chinese were also reluctant over a period of time, and it's only about 3 years back that the president of China, President Xi Jinping, in a speech commemorating China-ASEAN summit meeting in Beijing, used the expression Indo-Pacific while quoting from what is known as ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. There's a document. Maybe somebody mentioned this in the morning. How does India get into it? As I said, India was also an outlier. Asia-Pacific, Pacific Asia was the only story led by Japan from 1970s. It is this whole growing proximity of India with the United States. You can go back to 2005 or 2015. That change was also very significant because I always tell people, you already know it, if you befriend United States, it's a package deal. About 24 other countries automatically become your friends. The friends and allies of United States also immediately in the package deal become your friends. So India's relationship with a whole lot of other countries from Saudi Arabia to Philippines also transformed. And India began to be seen as a friendly country with the United States for a long time, repeatedly even now. They sometimes think India would be potentially an alliance partner. In fact, we have gone fairly close enough for a very erudite former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon to write a piece in which he says, even if we don't call it an alliance, the relationship of India with United States is like an alliance now. You couldn't have a more important and more reliable person to comment on a subject like this. So when India became closer to United States over a period of time, they started looking at India as an important friend in future. And then, of course, as United States was looking at Indo-Pacific as an attractive area, primarily with a motive of countering China, to restraining China, they looked at India as a possible countervailing. ASEAN has done that from 1970s to look at India as a countervailing power. India was always reluctant. We didn't want to get into any of the military tensions of any country in the region or at the global level. Now, of course, India is relatively more assertive in how India behaves. So, United States started engaging India. And the first important speech, I'm sure somebody mentioned in the morning, of a very famous Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, who came to India in August of 2007 and spoke of broader Asia. That we should not just look at Pacific Asia, but Asia is much bigger. Even today, for example, not many narratives or initiatives involve Central Asia or what we call West Asia or Americans call Middle East. They are all part of Asia. But then when Japanese Prime Minister looked at broader Asia, he spoke of ensuring this confluence of two oceans and making sure they are transparent and accountability and so on are ensured. That 2007 resulted in mid-career level officials beginning to talk to each other. Chinese immediately responded with enormous anger. There was change of leadership in Australia and Japan, and this, what is today called Quad, went to sleep for 10 years. No conversation. The conversation comes back in November of 2017, when in APEC summit meeting, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit meeting, President Trump, who obviously we are all familiar with his personality, started his very shrill tirade against Chinese. And he had an equally competent Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who used to make a clear distinction between Chinese people and the Communist Party. So much so that in 2019, I think, the foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi of Quad foreign ministers meeting had to issue 4 separate statements because they couldn't issue a single statement, given that Mike Pompeo was talking in very different language. Chinese were saying that Quad is emerging as an Asian NATO. Nobody today talks of Quad as an Asian NATO. And that is where India comes in. The credit goes to India for Beijing no longer being paranoid about Quad becoming an Asian NATO, because India stood all the pressure. India is the only country which is not alliance partner in the quadrilateral security dialogue for Indo-Pacific, which is Japan, Australia, United States, and India. Because very quickly there are 4 things, if you're looking at India's vision or strategy on Indo-Pacific, 4 things are basic for you to look at. June 1st, 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue speech of Indian Prime Minister, where he outlined 2 things that define India's vision on Indo-Pacific. 1, India would never like to see the region militarized. 2nd, India would not like any of the groupings in the Indo-Pacific becoming an exclusive club. And all groupings should be inclusive in that sense. These 2 points were underlined by Prime Minister. Same thing was further explicated, expanded by Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar, who gave another speech in Thailand, in Bangkok, in Chulalongkorn University in August of 2022. In November of 2019, Indian Prime Minister at East Asia Summit had enunciated what is called Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. I think one of the papers in this session is speaking on Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. In the same summit, they also signed a joint statement with ASEAN to ensure that Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative of India and ASEAN outlook in Indo-Pacific, the way they outline, will work together to implement some of those objectives, aims and objectives. fundamentally, and I think I'll take a couple of more, 2, 3 more minutes, and then I'll hopefully have the panelists speaking to you. What India brings on the table is not just world's largest population, 8% growth story of India's economy, which is all set to become third largest before 2030. Those are tangibles. And India's connectivity and contributions from look east to act east have transformed over a period of time. India is also bringing something more intangible to the table, which is India is promoting now what is called plurilateralism. We have heard of multipolarism, multilateralism, minilateralism. Now, plurilateralism, you must have heard Foreign Minister Jaishankar sometime explain these things, is when the overarching theme has a overarching number of countries that join together and they create specific silos within. And those subgroups are fluid. Countries can get in, get out anytime, depending on how much they can contribute to taking that initiative forward. So India's Indo-Pacific initiative is of that nature, with specific focal areas to focus on. But there is no secretariat, there is no constitution, there is no bylaws. It's flexible as far as people are focusing on what to take forward rather than focusing on rules and regulations, secretariat and positions and so on. So that is what India is trying to bring to the table, and similar examples are also already there. International Solar Alliance, Global Coalition of Biofuels, these are all similar plurilateral modes, because in 21st century, and that's my last point, we are no longer looking at building global orders in the 20th century or 19th century fashion of having membership, having a secretariat, having a charter, having all kinds of strict do's and don'ts. 21st century is about groupings. It's about networks. So BRICS groupings, for example, which is meeting soon in Kazan in Russia, or the quadrilateral security framework here, which is again flexible because there is also something called Quad Plus, and there is also something called Quad Plus Plus, just like BRICS Plus now has 10 members. So these are new formats of how nations want to work together in a more flexible fashion rather than in a tightrope regimented fashion. And India is perfectly comfortable with this. India is the flag bearer of that idea, and India is taking that idea to Indo-Pacific region, where we have multiple ways of engaging the region in terms of Act East, Act Far East, all the way to Vladivostok. So in that sense, India is also contributing both in tangible terms and intangible terms. And very last point, unlike several of these other Western nations, ASEAN and India are very similar in that sense of making all efforts inclusive. And both ASEAN has a soft voice on how we should deal with China. India also had a soft voice on how to deal with China. In fact, India has always said Russia and China are as much resident powers of Indo-Pacific as is the United States or any other country. Indeed, before we moved into pandemic and had Galwan incident, India on its own initiative had added Indo-Pacific to the agenda of annual maritime dialogues between India and China. Of course, relations have changed over a period of time, but we are noticing perhaps again, tone is changing and we could have India-China relations coming back to normal. So India in that sense, really the last point, last 30 seconds, India now looks at itself as unknown caller. Sorry, I should have stopped before 30 seconds and not take last 30 seconds. India today is looking at the whole globe in terms of standing up on its own feet without either trying to be close to Soviet Union, Russia, or trying to be close to United States. Increasingly, you notice a very assertive tone in India's foreign policy. And not the wolf warriors types, but fairly assertive. And in that sense, India looks at this region where, again, India wants to follow what we call multi-alignment. Working on as many projects with as many countries as we can without making any basic distinctions among friends and foes, which means, as an academic, I say, all great powers' foreign policy today is de-ideologized, de-territorialized. They are all today transactional. And India's foreign policy is becoming increasingly transactional. The best example to see is your every day on the screen you're looking at Middle East. India is very friendly with almost all major powers, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Iran to UAE to Israel. Countries that don't talk to each other are all talking to India. That's an example of plurilateralism, that's an example of multi-alignment, and that's an approach India has on Indo-Pacific as well. Thank you. Let me stop here, and Admiral Dhanoa is here now with us? Not yet. So let me see who I can call next. I think I could call my co-chair to take over and be the next speaker now. Thank you, everyone.